Chapter 17 is called the Stampede Trail. So this is about McCandless actually in Alaska on the Stampede Trail. Before we get into this though, I wanted to just back you up a page or two into chapter 16 because if you remember or you've been following, we got cut off a few minutes because I only have the 15-minute recordings. So we got cut off a few minutes and so I just left you hanging kind of in the end of chapter 16. But basically the bottom line to the end of 16 and how chapter 16 wraps up is right here. He's ready to exit. He finally like packed up all his stuff. He kind of figured that he had experienced what he needed to and he's ready to hike out to Alaska. But it talks about this river right here. This is where we'll start. And kind of recap to how this ends. On July 5th, however, the Teklanika was at full flood, swollen with rain and snowmelt from glaciers high in the Alaska range, running cold and fast. If he could reach the far shore, the remainder of the hike to the highway would be easy. But to get there, he'd have to negotiate a channel some 100 feet wide. The water, opaque with glacial sediment and only a few degrees warmer than the ice it had so recently been, was the color of wet concrete. Too deep to wade, it rumbled like a freight train. The powerful current would quickly knock him off his feet and carried him away. McCandless was a weak swimmer and had confessed to several people that he was in fact afraid of the water. Attempting to swim the numbingly cold torrent or even to paddle some sort of improvised raft across seemed too risky to consider. Just downstream from where the trail met the river, the Teklanika erupted into a chaos of boiling white water as it accelerated through the narrow gorge. Long before he could swim or paddle to the far shore, he'd be pulled into these rapids and drown. In his journal, he now wrote, "Disaster, reined in, river look impossible, lonely, scared." He concluded correctly that he would probably be swept to his death if he attempted to cross the Teklanika at that place in those conditions. It would be suicidal. It was simply not an option. If McCandless had walked a mile or so upstream, he would have discovered that the river broadened into a maze of braided channels. If he'd scouted carefully, by trial and error, he might have found a place where these braids were only chest deep. As strong as the current was running, it would have certainly knocked him off his feet, but by dog paddling and hopping along the bottom as he drifted downstream, he could conceivably have made it across before being carried into the gorge or succumbing to hypothermia. But it would still have been a very risky proposition. And at that point, McCandless had no reason to take such a risk. He'd been fending for himself quite nicely in the country. He probably understood that if he was patient and waited, the river would eventually drop to a level where it could be safely forded. After weighing his options, therefore, he settled on the most prudent course. He turned around and began walking to the west, back toward the bus, back into the fickle heart of the bush. So he's ready to leave, right? But now he's kind of trapped in because of this river. So here's the thing, you guys. A couple of things like, gosh, it's all these like small coincidences that kind of keep adding up against McCandless, right? Like the first thing you already know is that he headed into Alaska earlier than he really intended to. Like he went earlier in the spring than he wanted to, right? You know that he can't swim and he has a hard time, and now the river is like so engorged that he can't cross it himself. And now a few smaller things that keep happening, right? He kills the moose that he can't preserve. And I mean, my gosh, remember, he could have lived the whole time he was out there and then some on that moose had he properly taken care of that, if he had learned how to smoke it properly. But it is just like small things that keep adding up that like aren't usually he lucks out, right? And he keeps like think of all his past adventures from when he left college all the way up to here. Things always worked out for him. Now, little by little, these things are like weighing up against him. And there's a couple more things to come yet that, I mean, gosh, the bad luck just kind of keeps happening for him. All right, so chapter 17 starts with this little excerpt here from Henry David Thoreau. And the first line kind of says it all. It says, nature was here, something savage and awful, though beautiful. And now what this chapter is all about, and I'm just going to kind of summarize it through you guys, because it is now the author. If you look here, it says, a year and a week after Chris McCandless decided not to attempt to cross the Teclanica, I stand on the opposite bank. This is the author on the Stampede Trail right now. He's kind of tracking through McCandless's journey right now. So the author, John Krakauer, goes up to Alaska, and he himself is taking the Stampede Trail. So this chapter is all about the things he runs into as he kind of treks like McCandless does. And as a side note, you guys, you would not believe the people that still take this journey. Gosh, just last year, and I think I have it linked up on our Weebly page. If you go to our English 10 Weebly page, I think I looked up, there's this article where just last year, someone else did the same thing on the Stampede Trail and also wound up dead. These people now think like this pilgrimage to this bus is really like this life-altering thing. And sometimes there's tours that go there. And then sometimes in off times of the year when you shouldn't be up there, people will still try to venture out here by themselves, and they're still dying doing this. So it's almost like they're not learning from these lessons and all these risks that they're still taking, and it costs some of them their lives still. So there's still a lot of people who do this. So anyways, that's what Krakauer is doing. He's kind of tracking through McCandless's journey. And so he gives you in this chapter, if you want to know a little bit more about what the lay of the land was like, he talks about the things he went up there with, how the flood was to cross it was unthinkable, like he too couldn't. He's up there like kind of the same time of year basically. But here's the thing, you guys, that he finds. He says, unlike McCandless, I have in my backpack a topographic map. And you know what it tells him? Oh my gosh, you guys. It says, we arrived to find an inch-thick steel cable spanning the gorge, stretched between a 15-foot tower on our side of the river and an outcrop on the far shore 100 feet away. It's a cable-like pulley system with a bucket on it. If McCandless had had a proper map, remember he scrounged that one up at the gas station? It wasn't recent. It didn't have this listed on there. There's actually a pulley system with a bucket attached to it that you get into, and then you pull yourself across the river. And it was there a few miles up from where McCandless was. So had he had a decent map, he would have seen that on his map marked, and he could have got across the river and got out when he wanted to. So this is just another one of those things, that bad outdated map that he scrounged at that gas station. All right. So here he's just talking about how he goes to the bus and like the woods and stuff he had to traipse through to get there, and how it feels kind of eerie. He says like that first line from Thoreau in this chapter, how it seems really savage but peaceful. He says the same thing. He's like, it's kind of like this like ominous kind of creepy feeling being out there all by yourself, because you know it's kind of in the middle of nowhere. But anyway, when they get over, he talks about when he arrives at the bus after they hike the trail and everything like that. And all this blah, blah, blah goes on. And when he gets there, he says how he still sees things from McCandless like all around. His boots are there. They find his toenail clippers and his scrawlings that he wrote on the bus. There's still like memoirs basically all over from McCandless, which he says is really kind of creepy and whatever. Also on his journey, he talks to some of the people. Like if you guys remember in the beginning, Gordon Sammel and Ken Thompson right here, they're the ones who found McCandless's body. Well, here's an interesting side note. If you guys remember in the last chapter, he killed a moose, right? And he was so upset because he couldn't preserve it and he thought he wasted a life and blah, blah, blah. Well, these guys who are Alaskan outdoorsmen, right? They're totally insulting him. Right here he says, it was definitely a caribou, Samuel scornfully piped in. When I read in the paper he thought he shot a moose, that told me right there he was no Alaskan. There's a big difference between a moose and a caribou, a real big difference. You have to be pretty stupid not to be able to tell them apart. Well, guess what, guys? So they have the pictures of it and everything. And they turn it over, and guess what? They find out it really was a moose. So he knew what he was doing. So they're kind of now, they build into the chapter a little bit how to call him like green. When you call somebody green, it means like they're kind of a noob, like a novice, and they don't know what they're doing. But they're saying like to just play him off like he didn't know what he was doing and stuff, it isn't really doing justice to McCandless, because he had done a lot of adventures that kind of prepped him for this. He knew way more than we're giving him credit for, and he was a little more prepared. And then he goes on here and he starts in these pages I'm scanning through right now, guys. He's kind of comparing him to other great adventurers and stuff like that. And he's like, you know, a lot of men do the same thing, and here are these excellent adventurers like, and he names a couple of them and blah, blah, blah. Okay. And so he's saying a lot of guys are like this, don't dismiss him. He was prepared, that type of thing. He just kind of wanted to go for it. And we should kind of give him credit for that. All right. And that's basically how chapter 17 ends, guys. And now we're back to the ending of McCandless's story. So the last you saw, he had killed the moose, couldn't preserve it. He tried to hike out, but the river is too wild. He goes back to the bus, and this is where our story, chapter 18, picks up, that we'll get into in the next video.